Greetings! It is I, Tentus Dracovin, your Lord and Emperor here at the Dracovin Empire, and welcome! We're continuing our exciting adventures of exploring the Pathfinder world of Golarion. So if you've not joined us before, hey! I dive deep into the various countries and regions of Golarion, the world that the Pathfinder RPG, well, takes place in, if you're using the world that's established there. Granted, you could always use your own worlds, but I really do like the world that Paizo, the company that publishes Pathfinder, has created, and I like talking about it. Today, I'm going to be talking about Andoran. Now, if you missed a previous episode of about a week or two ago, I, for 4th of July, did Galt, the country very reminiscent of the French Revolution, because the French helped us during our War for Independence. But today, with Andoran, why am I doing it today? Well, tomorrow, if I'm going to date when this goes live on Twitch, it's Bastille Day, the French kind of Independence Day. So I'm doing the country that's more like us on the French one, and, you know, I did the French country on the It's Funny somewhere in the world. Don't worry about it. But we're talking about Andoran today. And Andoran is a very important nation in Golarion because it is the sign of a change in the world as it is. Very similar to how our country, the United States, or my country, I should say, really, and probably a bunch of my listeners, but not everyone out there. I assume some of you are on the globe, but so ours not probably the thing, but my country that I am in, United States, had a effect on bringing democracy to the world, much the same way Andoran's having an effect like that in Golarion, a world that, as we've seen, still has a lot of setup of nobles and rulership under that, maybe parliamentary governments at most. Anyway, so we're going to be diving depth into Andoran today. And let's get started with some of the basics that I always talk about, and the basics that I like to mention are some books that you can check out to look into this yourself. There are 2 books that you can find in physical form or PDF. Andoran, the Spirit of Liberty is the older of the 2 books. It still has some good information, but it is a little bit more outdated. And of course, the one that is a little newer by a few years, Andoran, Birthplace of Freedom. Basically what I'm talking about today. I'm going to be using a combination for my main research for today, though I did look at the previous book. I'm using mostly Andoran, Birthplace of Freedom, and as I usually suggest, I'm also using as a way to get my outline and some other information on the Pathfinder wiki, the Andoran page for that. So I'm using a combination of these 2 to provide you with as much information I can about Andoran. And let's move over to the Andoran symbol here as we go over some basics of this country. So, an important part about Andoran as a place is it's a nation of the people, very much like the United States is. And many nations now in our world as it is, that we have this self-government. This place has the common rule. The common rule gives every citizen voice. It's a philosophy that equality is important. No individual has the right to force their will or beliefs on another. It's a very stark contrast to things like slavery, servitude, and the governing body of Andoran is based upon this task. It has only existed, the government established under this common rule, since 4669 AR. And I will tell you, the current date in the Golarion world is always our year, but 47. So it's 4723. This is a nation that is less than 50 years old. And this is after the secession of from Chelax in the People's Revolt. Very similar revolution to Galt, which I talked about in a previous episode, but rather than murdering all the nobility, they were removed from power, prisons were empty, slaves were granted freedom. Common rule is an important part of Andoran. The people and the Birthplace of Freedom. So if you know a little bit about it, it would be a line neutral good. Alamis is its capital. The current ruler, as you would call it, who is the supreme elect, is Andoran and Andrea Marisk. Its government's parliamentary democracy, and major religions are Abadar, Kalen Kalian, Erastil, Iomade, and Shayla. So, that's some basics about it. Let's talk about its geography and its... actually, let's talk about its history first. Because history is an important thing to look upon when we talk about the Andoran people. This here is an important part of the entire thing. This is the Avoral Talmador, who's the spiritual patron of Andoran. So, we look at the Andoran timeline. It's a pretty long timeline. It's a country with history. But it's not some of the oldest nations of the world. I've talked about some in Golarion itself. The time period starts off during the army explorations of Taldane. And it was during the... if you don't know about these, I haven't really talked about Taldane. The armies of exploration were these attempts of military campaigns to increase the territory, wealth. They were expeditions into various regions along the inner sea to expand Taldor. And there were 8 of these. During the fourth army of exploration, this region, which became known as Andoran, was mapped. And this was in 1683. So this is when the area was effectively being settled. There was interest in the forests, natural resources of the area. So it was around 1707 AR that under General... I'm going to butcher some of these names along there. Calstastus of Corianton, Corianton being a major city, now under Cheliax, mentioned in some of my things, but at the time under Taldor, basically came into this area and conquered it. The coastal city of Augustana was founded the same year, and the trees of the Arthful Forest were basically taken down to expand the Imperial Navy. Augustana is a city that still exists in the country. We'll talk about it when we talk about the geography and areas. But it was around, it was by 1750 that Augustana became a major naval port for the Taldan Empire, and most of its navy was built there. So Andoran's navy and shipping industry kind of originates here, and it's a very important part of their tradition, still exists, even to this day. So this was a very big part of Taldor, getting this naval capacity, expanding into areas of Avastian, more into Grund, having influence in Aslant, Arcadia, spreading throughout the world in their power. So, the Forest of Andorra wasn't the only thing that was exploited, and by the time we get to the 6th Army exploration, which was very disastrous, the Taldane government conscripted local members of the Andoran militia to send them off to this battle in Grund. Many of them died, and Taldor's attempts to claim central Grund ended with the defeat by the Guerrilla King in 2089. This was a major point that marked a history in Andoran that the people remembered, basically. They remembered this. There were some more things that happened during this time period. There were some goblins that slaughtered the monks of Black Forest, releasing a supernatural horror. That was around 2724. I forgot to mention in 1980 AR, that's when the borders of the territory known as Andoran, which was still an area under the Taldorian Empire, basically claimed its borders. It was a region under their thing. But that was the time period, nearly 300 years after it was explored and the lands was claimed, it actually had a border as a proper territory. The rendering occurred in 3980 with Trostar's Clag, a huge eruption devastating an area known as the Darkmoon Vale. We'll talk about that region. There was mass flooding, crevices, a lot of damage. A lot of things happened. And what happens, the big event now is in 4081. This was during the Even Tongue Conquest. I've talked about this a little bit when I talked about Cheliax and when I talked about Gult on previous episodes. You can go check out. They're part of the playlist that this video is in. The Chaldean Empire was in a conflict, and aspects of the Even Tongue, basically, of the Cheliax region, sought to basically split the empire, and did so. I've talked about it before, but this was Quadria's invasion in Taldor. Cheliax split the empire and created the Cheliax nation, which at the time included Andoran, Gult, and a lot of other regions. So, Andoran was now under Cheliax, and it was a region under them. And, you know, for the next 600 or so, well, 500 so years, they flourished. They had been a pretty powerful area with, though, you know, having some regions, still having, like, a major city like Augustana being a major place of naval operations and building stuff like that. Great. But merchant towns, cities grew rich, natural resources were still exploited, there was a lot of power that, you know, came into the being in this area. So there was a lot of economic success. There were still problems. The northwestern wilderness had hobgoblin attacks. Pirates were still around. The Verduin Forest, which was also part of Gult when I talked about it, and Artful, which is next to it, had trouble with druids and fae. And, you know, there were setbacks along it. But this area grew in power. And then we get to an important part about all of this, about the growth and power. And again, there were plenty of things that happened during this time. There was, like, smaller events that if you had the Andoran Birthplace of Freedom, you can check out the book for some of these smaller events that are historical events that are very important, but I don't want to hit into everyone. But basically, we have the Cheliax Civil War and House Thrune winning, changing the nation of Cheliax to be Diabolus, to serve Asmodeus, and the cause of all this is, of course, the death of Erodin in 4606. Cheliax becomes chaotic. It has nearly 60 years of civil war, and then Thrune wins, basically. The thing is, with the chaos with Cheliax, there isn't a full government on Andoran. You know, there are still nobles that are under Cheliax control and people that are there from Cheliax appointment there, but Cheliax itself is dealing with its own issues in its region, and Andoran is kind of left on its own. This is also when the Gultian philosopher Darrell Yumbrock writes on government, going against the Cheliax government. We also, of course, have inspiration from Holstar, and then we have the Red Revolution in Gult. This inspires people with Andoran. And, you know, there's infernal powers being in charge of House Thrune, a lot of things with the noble bodies, you know, just, it leads to disruption in the area. And there's, like, again, Thrune claimed the house in 4640, and we have 30 years of dominance from Thrune now, influencing the entire region. We have, of course, the... sorry. Just dominance of Cheliax's new capital and their power and their queen, the People's Revolt happened in 4669 AR. Andoran merchants joined with the common folk on these principles that were built by Darl Yarbanek and Holsteller, and they declared independence from the Empire. They cast aside the nobles' right to rule, establishing the common rule, like I talked about at the beginner. But this is where the difference between Galt and Andoran comes about with their version of revolution. Andoran had its firebrands, but they didn't want the death of the nobles. They instead gave them a choice. They can stay, become citizens of this democracy, or be exiled. Their lands, holdings would become property of the state in either case, and would be sold off to help support the People's Revolt. It was a choice that they had. They, honestly, I'll talk about why this image is up here in a minute, but this is something to talk about. Mixed bag about their choices, and I'll talk about some factions within them that will talk about this, but this was a major event, and their revolution was successful. They repurposed their Eagle Nates into cooperation of military leaders. Cheliax set embargoes against them for its secession. Cheliax was able to control certain amounts of their territory, but again, Cheliax had their long civil war, resulting in a new government they were establishing. Even 30 years on after that civil war, they were not in a position to wage major wars against these regions revolting against them. So Galt, Andoran, a lot of these other places succeeded from the reign of Cheliax and became independent. Now, a big thing that they did was they abolished right away slavery, servitude, and embraced equality. These were codified in something called the Associatives Act of 4669, which was written by the first elected members of the People's Council, their government. I'll talk about their government later on today, but that's where this comes in. This act safeguarded the legal rights of citizens and enshrined a progressive economic emancipation. And Andoran, after at least 50 years, still embodies these concepts. And they will use force upon other nations that they feel, could be into, they push this will sometimes, forceful. Very American. A little too American in that one. So the Associates Act is it's the private sworn voluntary agreement to safeguard the right of every Andoran citizen. It is law. It is power. It is important. And any new laws the People's Council bring about have to be judged against this act that they have. It is the central tenet to their way of freedom and their democracy. Anyway, showing here is, of course, the Arches of Eredin, which have been a very important area. I've talked about them a few times before. They're under the control of Cheliax, but it's during this time period a bunch of Gilman came to the Democratic Nation, provided them the keystone of the Arch of Eredin, which they dragged from the bottom of the sea, basically subverting their commitment to freedom and equality. And the Archstone Monument, which is placed in the Fields of Concord in Almus, Almus, of course, being the capital, is a pretty important thing that has this keystone in it. So yeah, and it's said to bring good luck to those that touch it. It's a sign of the freedom. The current Supreme-Elect, just as a note here, because this is part of history, was elected in 4716, so just 7 years ago, and is Andrea Marosek, who succeeded Codwin the First, which would be mentioned in the book I have. Codwin the First is of Augustia, was elected in 4704, and had a number of terms. So, he had 3 terms as Supreme Elect, basically. It's every 4 years. So, it was in 47-16 he was breathing out, but had, 3 terms in office. But also, they're restricted to 3 terms in office is the restriction of Supreme Elect anyway, because of that. Basically, he got 3 terms. FDR was pooled in their nation, and that's why someone else was elected anyway. But anyway, she was a commander of the Steel Falcons, a branch of the Eagle Knights. She has connections to some other groups too, which we'll talk about when we talk about factions. Connections to the Twilight Talons, another group we'll talk about. And she's the youngest Supreme Elect that has been made, and has made international abolition a tenet of her administration. Basically, getting rid of slaves across the nation, across the Inner Sea, and we'll talk about that still today. We'll talk about the factions, too, related to it. For now, though, that's basically the history of Andoran, in a nutshell. Let's talk about Andoran proper. Let's talk about some of its regions. And to do that, we have to look at our nice map here. Actually, we want to do this one here. This is a little bigger. Yep. This is a map of Andoran. This shows off most of its regions, places that you could visit, cities and such like that. And you get a good idea of the size of it and where it's positioned. So Andoran is on the Inner Sea. So that below there is the Inner Sea. To its west is, of course, Cheliax. And it's separated by the Asphodel Mountains. The Five Kings Range to the north. The Dwarven Nation. And that separates Andoran from Drumar, Iskar, Kionin. And, of course, the Five King Mountains nation itself. To the east, of course, is Gult and Taldor. Taldor still exists. The eastern border, of course, has the Verduin Forest, which I talked about when I talked about Gult. And the Selen River, which also helps separate that out. I'm not going to dive too deep into the Verduin Forest. We'll talk about it a little bit here. There are then 5 regions. Almus and its countryside, the Arthful region, the agriculture-rich Cadaption's Plains, Darkmoon Vale, and the Verduin Forest. We're going to talk about all these regions. So it's got plains and hills, and it's got what's left of the Arthful Forest, the Darkmoon Vale in the northeast with the Droskar's Crag, the volcano, which is the southernmost point of Five Kings Range. Yep. Anyway, we will talk about the Verduin Forest in Andoran, though, as the region, as we dive into it. But let's talk about these various regions, each and every one of them, and talk a little bit about the places that are there. So, Almus. Almus has the city of Almus. That's the best way to describe it. Its countryside is around it, and it is a metropolis. It is over 76,000 people there, the majority of which are humans, followed by halflings and dwarves, and elves with similar populations. There's half-orcs, gnomes, others that are there. It is the center of all of Andoran, and it is one of the largest, most influential cities in the Inner Sea. It still is a massive city, incredibly important. Egalitarianism, multiculturalism are very big parts of it, there are still assumptions and prejudices that are held about Andoran society that, unfortunately, a lot of the city actually puts forward. So when someone talks about Andoran society and has prejudices or assumptions about it, unfortunately, Almus kind of shows a lot of that off, just in the nature of it. It is the it's the essence of Andoran. So it is an older city than that. It is one that predates the founding of the nation of Cheliax. It was area that was settled, much like the other city I talked about, Augustana, around the same time during the Fourth Army exploration. So, the thing is, though, it's not really mentioned in history until Droskar's Crag erupts and all the flooding of the Andoran River inundated the city of Alnus. So, though it was around and it was a city, it really wasn't major for a very long period of time. And it wasn't until the People's Revolt that we really get that things get important here. The thing is, the major uprising was led here. The major suffrage for all the citizens. Almus erupted in riots in 4669, joining together, and, this is where it came apart. It was this one point in here that everything began, in a way, you could say. It's a trade center in the Inner Sea. Huge markets, not as large as Absalom, or not as varied as Capatesh, but very important here. They have duty-free markets that make it very important, and the Great Andorian Fair annually, a festival that lasts the whole month of Serenith, and traders and people swell from all across Golarion to visit the place. Private businesses are both importing and exporting goods on a daily basis. So, though, again, maybe not the biggest trade city, it's a very important trade city, and honestly, you can find a lot of stuff there. There's the East Hill Districts, Liberty District, North End, Portside, and Talmus District. It's on the southern coast, at the mouth of the Andoran River on the Inner Sea. It's built into a series of hills with bridges connecting over smaller rivers. It's the spiritual center of the spiritual center is the Field of Concord. There's some important parts here. Of course, this comes down to the Almus region, Freeland, the area around it, with small villages and areas and farmstead. And this is a big important about Andoran, is the Almus countryside, which is part of their region, is home to about 2/3 of the entire population. This is Freeland. This was area that was owned by nobility taken over during the revolt. So, it is a major city with this major river and smaller river, a lot of bridges, massive districts, a trade center right on the coast. Again, I would recommend the Andoran Birthplace of Freedom. It has a pretty good, deeper dive into the entire city, at least of, as of 4715. So 6 years difference, but you can get the city stats are there too, if you want to use it as a major point in your adventures. Let's talk about Arthfell. So this is the second of the regions to talk about. As I said, there are 5 regions that we will hit upon today as talking about them. Just to go over the basics information. So, as you can see on the map I've provided here for you all to look at, the Arthfell region is around the Arthfell Forest. So, we have Almus and its region kind of like near the Misa Shelf. So that's kind of that area around there. That's the region of it. And then we have the Darkmoon Vale in the north, the Verudin Forest in the east, the Compendon Fields kind of north of Almus, and then the Arthfell Forest and its region in the west. Just to give you an idea of the 5 regions that are here, and kind of pointing out where they are. So, Arthfell region, it's your western border, it's going up to Chelex, it's got the Andoran River going through it, the Nagrotha Plains, it's got Augustana, the shipbuilding industry, the logging industry. Again, the Arthfell Forest is here too. It's much smaller than it was because of the logging industry, because of Augustana. But still, there is the shipyards of Agastana, which have existed for thousands of years, still there. There are still those that protect the Arthel Forest. There is some other dangers that go on there. There are druids and fae from the forest that still try to protect what's left of it. But it would be considered more of an industrial center for all of it. They're hardworking people in Arthfell. They're support Andoran, but they're probably not as loyal to Alamus. There's plenty of areas that had former noble lands that were taken over during the People's Revolt. So this place is a very kind of probably would be disguised as laid back. Noble settlements other than Agastana, there's Alvis, Callis, Crimerium, Laviton, Riverford. We'll talk about each of these just a little bit. Lumber, ships are still very heavily provided here. So the thing is, Doran's navy still kind of originates from here. Agastana still is incredibly important. It's still a major seaport. It has still a huge amount of influence. It is still, with its rich history and power base, still just important. And still has massive amounts of fleet power. Alvis is a small fishing village that has grown to some notoriety because of the Andoran Alchemical Society kind of being connected to it. Classis is a small residential area that is marked for some connections to the Eagle Knights and some history there. Cranium is a fishing village, but it's within the ruins of an ancient Chaldean fortress that was once in there, that kind of lost its connections and kind of fell apart during the Even-Tongue Conquest about 600 years ago. So it has some importance because of that. Laviton tends to be kind of unassuming, but there are some connections there to see that you can look into yourself. And of course, Riverford is the last of the towns. Yeah. It's the only of these places that's landlocked, of these important settlements in all the area too, and it does have some strategic importance. So it's a strategic importance in this area of Aridin. It's and has a lot of cattle that's produced there. So it's got a lot of agricultural wealth in Riverford and has some strategic importance. Of course, the Arthfell Forest is still there. Still has a lot of lumber and stuff, and the areas that are, though, remaining are some of the more ancient, more powerful forests. The Lumber Consortium, who's a group I'll talk about a little bit later when it comes to their economy, is trying to get into it, but there are issues there that happen. It's something to talk about. Of course, there's the Arthel Peaks, Aspo Bay, Cape of Hope, and the Norgathan Necropolis, which is an ancient necropolis there that has tombs and undead that come from it occasionally. That might be a threat if you're in that region. The Carpedon Plains, which of course has its own capital, or what would be effectively its capital, Carpedon. This is kind of the eastern banks of the Ashedan River to the Verdoran Forest. It's the rolling lands of the southwest and south of the Verdoran Forest, the plains region that it gets. It also has, other than Carpedon, the town itself has Sourton, Sawston, Stayer, Trilea. I'm probably butchering these names as I keep saying. These would kind of be thought as Aridin's rolling hills and farmlands and green Velps. It has still a lot of that. A lot of vile foodstuffs, grains, grapes, wines, olives, melons, vegetables that are produced here are a lot of it. But a large portion of the exports that Aridin do come from here. So not only is it a grain basket, but this is an export grain basket kind of area. So a lot of wealth that comes into it. And It's positioned between the Verdant Forest and its wilds and the heavily traveled Ashton River, which heads down to the capital, means that, generally speaking, travel is pretty safe. The wilds of the Verdant Forest kind of stay to themselves, but also keep things from being dangerous in the area. But there are this conflict between natural resources in itself that still exist. This is a heartland. It's the rural interior of the nation. Most of the population here doesn't have a huge urban life. There's only small cities at most. There's not a lot of threats or anything like that. It's, you know, they say, like, if you're an adventurer from Eridan, you probably started here with small things, doing things to help out the little area. This is a living off the land or something before you went off on adventures. So Capuchin is the closest thing to a capital this region has. It's a small city, probably the most influential settlement in the entire region. It's got its name after the entire region, of course. And it's basically 7 district settlements that have kind of, each on their own hill, which kind of amalgamated into their own city at some point in time, into these 7 neighborhoods. So, again, it's not a huge place, but an influential place in all the map. West Hill, Sourton is the northern reaches of the plains. Got kind of dry, rockier soil, stone buildings. Vineyards are good in this area. Souston is east of Almas. It's kind of brightly painted area with some lore to it along the coast. A lot of fisher folk, and suffers from pirate attacks, strangely, even though not really a lot of value there. Anyway, Stair is deep inland along the Selin River, and has murals of the Galtian revolutionary folk heroes in the area, strangely enough. So, artists, philosophers, poets, and writers that have fled Galt show up in Stair. So, I talked about Galt in a previous episode and how it used to be an artist place, but then became a place of revolution. This is where the artists flee to, if they can get out of the country. And Trailing is a small seaside trading post, growing a little larger and more important in this entire region. Darkmoon Vale. Let's talk about that, and I can kind of switch over to this image, which is from, connected to Darkmoon Vale. So this is a frontier region in the northwest of Andoran, from the Arthfell Forest, through Drosscrabb's Crag, and the Darkmoon Woods. Notable settlements are Falcon's Hollow, Ulfheden, Origant, and Piran's Bluff. So, there are very few Eridans that are unfamiliar with this region. It was tamed centuries ago by Karis Naftian, who's known as the Falcon, kind of pacifying lawless Kelid natives and making it a settled region. It's still very dangerous and wild. It is the wilderness area, almost, you could say. The Lumber Consortium has its headquarters in the city of Origant here, and covets the region for a lot of its rimberg, the Darkwood trees, the Darkmoon Vale, and many of its forests, trying as much to get control of them and stuff, and the Darkmoon Wood, which is in the region. There's logging in the region that thin the forests. But the Fae have become more and more dangerous as they've done more and more to get rid of the forest. They don't like their home going away. Lycanthropes also travel the area. Brigands that are actually werewolves in disguise can be a definite problem there. And of course, Droxar's Crag is active. The rending, which took place, which I mentioned in 3980, a major volcanic eruption destroying the dwarven settlement of Jarnasnol, flooding the Almus, flooding sections of Almus with snowmelt, opening Cadlestone Caverns to the surface. A lot of horrible things happen that area. So Organt would be considered kind of the capital of this region. It's the largest city in the region. The Lumber Consortium is going out of here doing their best to cut down the forest and stuff. That would be the biggest city. Other settlements, of course, Falcon's Hollow is on the edge of Darkmoon's Vale, and it's a small logging town. Ulfheden, along the Eberbeck Rise, is kind of a quiet farm town off of Ulfheden, where this is a place where many Eagle Knights retire to. And, of course, Puritan's Bluff, which is on a rocky plateau overlooking a canyon along the trails of the Asphodel Mountains, is another small village there. So, yeah. Interesting region that you could visit. And finally, there's, of course, the Verduran Forest, where there are 3 settlements in the Verduran Forest region connected in Eredin. Because remember, this is a forest that's in multiple countries. I talked about that. There are about 3 places here that you can talk about that are cities. Bellis, Caldamin, and Fussel. Bellis being the largest of those. So, this is Aradin's border with Taldor, a little bit with Galt. It is defended by the fact it's a wild forest. There are other small towns and villages that lie on the Verduran Forest's edge. Many humanoids do live in the deep forest too. Among the forest dwellers are the primordial ones. They kind of remove themselves from civilization. They're like hardy rangers, druid circles, lone hunters, wildlings that don't recognize the borders between Andoran and Taldor. And these have been a source of issues there. They're also druids, guardian fae. This area prevents a lot of reach of the Lumber Consortium, which I've mentioned a few times. The forest has suffered some fate by them, but they've done a much better job than Ashenfell Forest or the Darkmoon Vale at keeping them out. They're also pretty far from Augustana, major shipyards, so it's hard for lumber from there to go as far as something like the shipwrecks, where Arthel Forest and Darkmoon Vale are relatively close to the shipwrights and pretty easy to send stuff there. So local lumberjacks are pretty much there, are the main source of things there. The consortium's whole really doesn't exist as much. So Bellis City, it's actually a large town, is best known for its apiaries, its honey, and its wax. And Bellis honey and wax are prized throughout the Inner Sea region. They're the most respected. Some of the most respected members of the community are the beekeepers of Bellis. And their opinions, especially when it comes to Bellis' economy, carries extensive weight. Many beekeepers are, in fact, druids who make their home near Bellis. It's another region that has helped control the forest. Having this power base has helped keep the forest from being, again, the forest still remains wild. Yes, it has had some logging, but not nearly as much as any of the others. It has maintained itself so much more. The other settlements, Caldamin, a kind of small royal town on the northern edge of the forest, on the Dragonfly River. It's kind of desolate. It's got towns that have stood for less than a century, weathered planks, wood folk that kind of work there, and Fussel, which is the center of the Verduran Forest, an odd backwater place that connects with a lot of the stuff in the forest and kind of goes out there too. So those are, and technically is Andoran. So that is Andoran's geography, its region that we can talk about. Let's talk about of course, government first. Or next, I should say. Because government, and we will talk about its factions in a minute too, are very important. So, the Andoran government has 3 basic principles that it's built on. The tolerance of all benevolent religions. So it's kind of a version of religious freedom, but your religion has to be benevolent. That's an important distinction between it. AKA, cough, cough, Asmodeus, cough, cough, not looked at as well. Anyway, a transparent government, and an efficient and prosperous system of trade. To ensure these are treated fairly and no one abuses the power of their office, public service and Andoran are always regarded with a measure of suspicion and subject to regular scrutiny. The main part of this government, of course, is the People's Council, the major ruling body with a group of 350 representatives. It's based out of course, Almas. These individuals are elected by the nation's population every 5 years. Andoran is divided into numerous municipalities, each of which is allowed to elect a single representative to the council. In addition, every major guild in the nation is also granted a representative. So, these individuals combined are overseeing all aspects of the nation's government. That selects mayors for each municipality to running the military forces. This is everything that they do. They meet in the location known as the Palace of the People's Council, on the west end of the Fields of Concord and Almas. These are technically still ordinary citizens. Many do maintain a lifestyle that resembles the pre-revolution aristocracy, so there is a little bit of a disconnect there. Anyway, the council is led by the Supreme Elect. We're going to talk about that in a second there. They hold public meetings in the capital every 6 months. Special sections can be called as needed. They appoint magistrates, draft laws that follow the nation's constitution, the Associative Act. They select all the mayors, as I said, appoint the Supreme Vicar to serve as an advisor to the Supreme Elect. We'll talk about that in a second. It also elects one of its members to become the public spokesperson, the People's Voice. The current People's Voice is held by, as of 4715, it's a position held by Jarlissa Hermadas. She's in a 3-year long-term, and she's a former veteran career politician, and current People's Voice. The Supreme Vicar, to note, is the worldly spiritual authority. Basically, the person that's elected the Supreme Vicar is supposed to be the person that is the advisor to the Supreme Elect on religious matters. Also, the military forces are led by a group of 30 consuls who are also members of the People's Council. They possess executive control over the nation and the Army and Navy, including the current commander of the Eagle Knights, General Reginald Cormoth. The Supreme Elect, then, as we talked about it, is appointed by the Council following each election. The Supreme Elect manages the nation's executive office and acts as a mayor of Almas. The Supreme Vicar, also to note, acts as the Bishop of Almas and looks after all the Andorian faiths, basically. So, the Supreme Elect has a residence in the Citadel of the Supreme Elect, a small walled keep on the western end of the Field of Concord, and it's protected by a battalion of Steel Falcons. We're going to talk about a bunch of these groups. We're going to be talking about them. The Eagle Knights, the Steel Falcons, and the Twilight Talons, and some other factions to talk about. So, there are other advisors to the Supreme Elect. There are 30 ministers known as the Demarchy Assemble, They're chosen from a lottery of a pool of eligible candidates from all over Andoran. There's like the houses of their offices are the House of Denmark Assemble on the grounds of the Citadel of the Supreme Elect. It's slightly different than the Supreme Vicar, which is another kind of thing. As again, Coden the First of Augustana was the last one. Now we have Andre Muskris. Yeah. So the Denmarky Assembly has their Council of Finance, Foreign Affairs, Justice, Trade, Commerce, Economy, Military, all people that basically kind of through lottery give information. Factions. Let's talk a little bit about factions. So, the Eagle Knights are one of the major factions we can talk about. As I said, General Reginald Cormith is their current head, but they are the embodiment of Andorian idealism. They are loyal, dedicated warriors who protect their nation, but also the tenets of liberty, equality, and justice. The Eagle Knights were founded in 4600 as an honor guard for Eredin upon his prophesied return by Andoran's appointed king at the time, Calham I. And their evolution in what they are happened as part of course, the revolution. You know, Eredin's death. The knights will help bring order across the land and stuff like that. Basically, as the revolution happened, the nobles with Cheliaxian tie, the Andorian nobles, tried to send the Eagle Knights into the Civil War. But the Eagle Knights were sworn to protect the Andorian people, not to serve the noble lords. That's the thing that happened with the Eagle Knights. The way they were established was as a group to protect the people, to protect the citizens. That's what they were established for. So yes, they to a degree originally had loyalty to the nobility of Andoran. But because of their tenets, because of the way things were, the Eagle Knights didn't do anything. They basically stood neutral, which you could say, but they didn't join the revolution. But think about this. They were caught between two groups, the people and the thing. And by not siding with either side, they were basically able to say, like, this is not an issue of us and protecting Andoran. This is an issue for Andoran to decide. You know, they remained neutral. But the revolution was bloodless in Andoran. That's the thing that we have to talk about. There was no bloodshed there. So, when the revolution was successful, they were able to join with Andoran and become this symbol of stability, order of the common people. So they do consider themselves an independent organization that only answers to the office of the Supreme Elect. And they are overseen by the 30 consuls of the People's Council. There were dangers that the People's Revolt brought about them, their neutrality during the conflict. But the fact is that the Knights had always acted with this honor, meant that they were able to stay. So that's why they have remained a fairly major faction because of this. So the Eagle Knights, again, have maintained themselves as a major group, a major faction within Andoran. This here is shown as one of the Steel Falcons. which is, of the three branches of the Eagle Knights, the most renowned. They are the ones that attack slave galleons, liberate slaves throughout the Inner Sea. The current Supreme-Elect was a general and commander of the Steel Falcons, of the Eagle Knights, basically liberating slaves throughout the Inner Sea, much to the chagrin of a bunch of other slaver nations. And the Grey Corsairs are the naval arm of the Steel Falcons. So that's the connection that the current Supreme-Elect has to the Eagle Knights. She was an Eagle Knight. The other factions are the Golden Legion and the Twilight Talons. These are the three branches of it. The Golden Legion is the group that protects the borders of the nation. That's their primary goal, is to make sure Andoran's borders remain secure. They also try to make sure the interior trade routes maintain themselves. As I said, Steel Falcons, they don't protect Andoran proper. They're all about spreading Andoran philosophy of common rule, going against slavery to the world. And of course then the third faction is the Twilight Talons, who are the espionage group of them. They tend to be not acknowledged by the government. Spies, saboteurs, deep cover agents, assassins. They do things like target slavers, agents of House Thrune. Basically, they go to other places and do things in order to protect the democracy of Andoran. They look to threats outside of that. And of course, again, Andoran Marset has some connections with the Twilight Talons too. So, I mean, you know, has connections to both those branches. Yeah. I did mention the Grey Corsairs, a sub-branch of the Sea Falcons. We can talk about the... So those are the special factions that we want to talk about, but there are three other factions to mention. The Lumber Consortium, which we're going to talk about in a minute when I talk about some of the economy and stuff related to this. But we also want to talk about the Primordial ones, the Druids of the Verduin Forest, as they are a faction unto themselves. I mentioned them briefly. And of course the Seven Houses, which are a group that does actually exist in Andoran. What are the Seven Houses? They are former nobles of Andoran who lost a lot of their power during the revolution. But these seven houses, basically seven families, which were several hundred members of the families that basically survived what happened. They're of Taldan descent, so they're not technically Cheliax. These are Taldan nobles that basically survived getting into Cheliax rule. They still had power. And the thing is, they had high positions in Almist and Augustana. They saw what was happening when Cheliax brought chaos in its civil war to Andoran. They basically saw that things might not go well, even then. So they sold off a lot of their land, hid away a lot of their wealth and resources. A few from this group basically was able to maintain a public face still, maintain some wealth and privilege by using business relations and basically elected positions in government. So there were some of these that basically used the fact that they had businesses to pretty much go like, I side with you. I'm going to keep running my business. I don't have to be a noble anymore, but I can keep my stuff because I got it through. I can support this through the businesses I own. And I'm more economic now, focused rather than rulership. Others basically went to other parts of Andoran, adopted new names, basically hid themselves there. So basically, these seven houses have their former family crests. They identify themselves. They're suspect of their nature, but they still do exist as this group in there. Some of them like to take advantage of their education, wit, to get, especially in poorer districts, where they're to get elected to the People's Council. Other are more subtle with their influence, but they are a group that exists as a almost shadow group within Andoran politics. They try to maintain what little power they have. They've got covert acts, assassination, murder, blackmail, slander, kidnapping, riots to tear down other political candidates, to kind of fight them. So they are a group within Andoran that you have to remember exists. The 7 houses. So though there's freedom, there is a basically most old noble group still there. They still exist. Let's talk about the economy then. This here is, for the image I'm showing off now, is a member of the Lumber Consortium, which we've talked about a few times. A group that has control over definite some reasons and dominates them. But when we talk about... Oh, I forgot to do some other things to talk about. Before we talk about the Lumber Consortium, we can go back for a second. Jumping the gun here for the Andorian and stuff too. Just to mention some things about their connections with other people. This is important stuff. So, they are the only open democracy in the Inner Sea region. This means that they have a lot of autocratic neighbors, and they have a pretty poor connection with them. So there's a lot of foreign powers that they don't get along about, you know, and the People's Revolt, a lot of nations are worried that that might happen to them too. You know, and this is reinforced by the fact that Andoran likes to spread its culture, its mercantile, its philosophical beliefs beyond its borders a lot. And the fact that they bring about military might to bring about their goals when nothing else remains. Andoran is kind of scary to its neighbors. And especially now because since they freed all the prisoners, freed all its slaves, ethically most of the time, because a lot of its prisoners were a mixed bag of, you know, people and stuff. Most of them were in there for political and stuff reasons and not good reasons. Freeing them all to bolster basically their power in the revolt meant that they have this very anti-slavery take. They forbid trading of any sentient creature. The thing is, though, we talked about it with their knights and stuff. They send out groups to basically undermine it abroad. So other groups that still practice it, Cheliax, Kapatesh, Osirian, Thuvia, they go at odds with them particularly. Those 4 nations are the major remaining nations, especially in the Inner Sea region, that practice slavery. Again, to different degrees and stuff like that. But still, a lot of these nations see them as troublemakers. Kapeshi slavers have been in the crosshairs of the Andorian government constantly. So, Codwin I, the previous supreme-elect, made it legal to board and sink Kapeshi slave ships in 4704. And basically, the Grey Crusaders sank 3 of these ships the following year and began the Andorian War of Slavery. Something that they've been working on. There's a split button. So, yeah. It's, they have quite a reputation against it. So, effectively, they've done a pretty good job of, you know, starting this. And it's their war against this concept. And certainly there's a lot of nations that have gone against that now, a lot of freak nations, nations that are changing their ways. But they're there fighting against it constantly. Anyway, Lumber Consortium. let's talk about them and the other economic forces in Andoran. So, regardless of how many thousands of years it's been exploited, it's still a nation of natural resources. Lumber, minerals, goods, ships constantly are being transported out of Almus and Augustana for places throughout the Inner Sea, and even beyond there. There are 3 leading exporters: House Godfield, House Naran, and House Valen. They operate large, profitable banks in the region, and Andoran's banks provide readily accessible and affordable credit to the nation's people. Anybody who exploits, though, their banking systems are exiled from the nation as traitors. That's an important thing to know. The most successful bank, of course, is under House Naran, called Foresters Endowments, and they've been one of the government's biggest supplier of naval vessels. And they still are. One of the reasons that they're varied. They have 22 branches across the Inner Sea and employs 132 clerks. So you can see there's very big things. Andoran profits and resources from resources beyond its borders. Well, artifacts and resources originating from exotic locations, Siren, Mwagi Expanse, Aslant, Arcadia, are gathered here and sold then. Some are rare, often difficult to maintain, with groups fighting over them. It adds a lot of wealth to Andoran. And though there is some competition with Cheliax and Talador, Andoran is basically like, you think about Talador as the original power in this region, followed by Cheliax when they broke away. They became a second power. Andoran has become the third power in the Inner Sea region. A lot of it has been. The Lumber Consortium, as I had, has basically a monopoly on hardwood and darkwood in the region here. So they are a major faction. And they are a remnant of the Chelish holdings. They still have seen their wealth and influence decline during democracy. They still have great pressure on a lot of the smaller, weaker regions and communities. They were founded in 1853 AR to supply lumber to Talador. And little is known about this other than that was their founding up until Ulfheden was founded in 4128. So, in the Darkmoon Vale region, which they have their headstones. So, they've got a board of directors in that area and share companies, profits, and such. So they are an important faction, actually, within the entire region. And let's finish up today by talking a little bit more about who lives in Andoran. Of course, mostly humans. And there are 2 descents, Chelaxian descent, Taldan descent. The not most common non-human race, of course, is halflings. They also have one of the largest concentrations of kobolds in the entire Inner Sea regions, and, well, I put it here, one of the largest group of Azimers. They're passionate. A lot of the Andoran citizens are passionate about their country and their freedom. The thing is, the region known as Andoran has been ruled by foreign powers for so much time. First the Talador, then Cheliax, and a lot of times a lot of heavy burden on them because of these control. The independence of the people, the resources were worn away, and they could not tolerate that. So they claimed their sovereignty, and they want to prove that freedom and equality are concepts you can hold through any hardship. That's something that the Andorans hold dearly in their hearts. They're very patriotic. In general. Certainly other regions, they vary depending on the regions and the inhabitants and stuff. And one of the big things about all the regions, though, and the people of the nation are, they're very highly opinionated. And many of them have different perspectives on how best to preserve their nation and spread its influence. There are some common beliefs, but arguments and discussions are based on merits rather than half-truths and falsehoods. Everybody should voice their, have the right to say their voice, and actions should be judged above all else. And as long as your opinion is not that of a foreign power, you're entitled to it. So, the main language that's spoken, of course, is Taldane. It's a former province of Taldor, and the common tongue in most of that region still remains Taldane. It's the common tongue of a lot of that area. But that's basically Taldor. So Taldor, not Taldor, Andoran. Andoran is a interesting country because, yes, it has a very different history than something like our nation, or my nation. And many of the people that are watching this, probably, a lot of my viewers are American, but not all of them. I should not just say our, but my nation, where I come from. As someone from this nation, I can see a lot of connections to my history and this history of this nation, Andoran. Certainly, there are a lot of differences, too. It's the differences that the world of Golarion is. It's a very different planet than what we have in our world. But this idea of democracy, its way of doing things, its connections, its government being still very different, but having some, connections and a democracy that this nation is formed on, this idea of freedom, of your voice being heard, of choice, and ultimately being a very interesting nation for this way that it's evolved and these choices that it has. Andoran is a sign of perhaps an evolution of Golarion as a whole. Golarion has seen, in its last 100 years, massive upsets across the world from Eridan's death. When Eridan disappeared, Eridan died, the world broke to a degree. The world changed. And now, 120 years later, pieces are being picked up everywhere. And Andoran has found itself in the forefront of a new way of doing things. A new way that might spread to other nations. Might change things throughout this land. To make many nations change. Maybe it won't. Who knows? But certainly, ideas of freedom are becoming more and more popular. A lot of the nations I've talked about, many of them have different ways of thinking, have different ways of doing things. Some of them, certainly, feel a lot similar. This idea of representation is becoming more popular. Ustala, Druma, Galt, as much as it's murderous, all have representation in some way. They are nations. Maybe there still are nobility in a lot of these places. Maybe they're not a democracy like Andoran. But people speaking up, people having opinion, still exist and are becoming more important to a lot of Vastin and the Inner Sea. It's a world changing, and Andoran, through word or violence, is becoming the forefront of it. And freedom will ring as long as they exist. Thank you for joining me on this adventure to it. To anybody who watches me in France, happy Bastille Day. This will probably be going up on Bastille Day, ironically, because I'm filming this the day before that. Streaming this, I should say. I hope everybody else has a great rest of your day. Remember, if you want to see my tabletop-related stuff live, it's every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, usually at around early afternoon for Tuesday, Thursday, late morning, Saturdays. And this will, of course, go up on YouTube. So if you are joining me on Twitch, follow would be wonderful. That's the easiest kind of support I would give. If you're following me on YouTube, a subscription, a like, comment, always great. There are always great other ways to support me. Patreon, subscriptions on Twitch, things like that. Anyway. And if you want to see my brain farts, know what's going on for scheduling and stuff like that, my Discord and Twitter are great places for that, where I have my schedule and occasional brain farts. Those are all the great ways to support me, kind of check out all this stuff. I hope all of you there, though, have, again, a great rest of your day. And I'm going to pop off here and say, for now, farewell to all of you out there.